So, yeah, welcome everyone. I'm just trying to see who's all here. So we've got some people from Gela, some others that have joined. It's good to see you all. We probably don't have time to kind of go around and do introductions. I'm sorry about that. So I'll just introduce myself. I think everyone knows me, but if you don't, my name's Sara Cooper, and I'm based here at Cochrane, South Africa. So really here I'm going to be giving a very basic introduction to qualitative evidence synthesis. This it's come out of the GELA, the Global Evidence Local Adaptation Project, where there was a real expression of need to have some training in qualitative evidence synthesis, but I think we've now distributed the link more widely, so others are joining from other spaces of life. Let me just, Ari and Denny, I don't know if you guys are able to, if I can admit people. Are you able to admit people if they join? Okay, so I'm going to go into full screen shortly, but just before I do, so I can still see you guys, I just going to say a few things. So the first thing is that so that people know that these slides that I'm going to present and the recording will be available on the link that I've provided here. Thanks to Ari, has created this for us. So you will be able to access that.
Checked for images and signs as
sorry, if everyone wouldn't mind just muting themselves.
Many procedures must be done quickly, efficiently, and correctly. Much practice and experience needed to perform.
How do I mute?
Sorry, there. Thanks.
I don't have the right.
The powers to mute people. I'm also just seeing. Okay, let's see how we go. So yeah, the recordings, the slides and the recording will be available at this link that I'm showing. For those of you that are part of GELA, we'll also put it in the Teams folder under Work Package 6. And Ari's very kindly said, if you have any problems, please you can contact him at this email, and you can also email me if there are any issues. So, as I said, this is really going to be a very brief introduction to the principles of conducting and interpreting. Just one last slide. Yeah, thanks, Ari. In conducting and interpreting qualitative evidence synthesis, or what is called a QES. So at the end of this, you should have a basic understanding of what a QES is, why one would undertake a QES, and what are the main steps in conducting a QES. So just before I put into presenter mode, just to get a sense from you guys, maybe you could just put a thumbs up or type in the chat or give some indication so that I have a little sense of your guys' experience. So I wonder if you could indicate if you've ever carried out a systematic review of quantitative research. So a kind of effectiveness review of some sort, or a prevalence review, or some kind of systematic review. Okay, thanks. So we've got some thumbs up here. Okay, and what about carried out a primary qualitative research? So has anyone here done any kind of primary qualitative study? Yeah. Okay, here. Good to know. And what about a qualitative evidence synthesis? So have you ever conducted, or are you currently conducting a systematic review of qualitative research, or a QES? Okay, so we have some experience. So yeah, okay, great, fantastic here. Okay, and then finally, has anyone used the results from qualitative research in a decision-making process? It's a kind of policy or a guideline kind of drawn on qualitative research. Yeah. Okay, brilliant. Yeah, so we've got a mix of experiences. So there's going to be lots of learning, hopefully, here. Let me now go into current. Okay, can you all see my screen, and is it in presenter mode here? Okay, so let me just move that here. Okay, so just to acknowledge some of these resources on the slide, which really inform the content of this workshop. And I particularly want to flag the last resource on this slide. Really, I very much recommend people look at this resource. So it's Cochrane Epoch developed a template for conducting a qualitative evidence synthesis. And the template really includes recommended text and guidance and examples for the different components of a protocol and then the synthesis. And the template also really draws on the Cochrane Qualitative and Implementation Methods group. So it's really kind of the latest thinking in QES. So it's incredibly useful. And I've put the link here to access this. So when I share the slides, you'll have access to this. So in this presentation, I'm going to highlight the different stages of conducting a QES, which very much draws on this guidance and the content from this template. And I'm also going to provide sort of flag some key resources for each stage. So kind of if you want to just get familiar with the stage, a kind of basic resource to look at. I've tried to flag for each of the stages. And for those of you that are part of GELA, also in our shared GELA folder. Okay, so please feel free to raise your hand, ask questions. I also have put in lots of breaks for questions and discussion and a few exercises through this, so there will be formal time, but please also just feel free to add. My colleagues Denny and Ari will also watch that for me, as unfortunately I can't see when I'm in presenter mode. Okay, so before going into what is qualitative evidence synthesis, I think it's important to get a bit of an understanding of what qualitative research is. So qualitative research aims to explore people's perceptions and experiences of the world around them, including of health, illness and health, and social care services. There really are, it's almost an umbrella term to talk about qualitative research. There are a huge number of different approaches, but there's some kind of broad characteristics that that arguably cut across all kind of qualitative research, well, most qualitative research approaches. So I want to highlight some of these. So first characteristic is that in most cases, qualitative research really focuses on understanding and interpretation rather than measurement. So you'll find qualitative research asks questions such as what and how and why of phenomena, rather than kind of questions of how many or how much. A second very common characteristic of qualitative research is that it usually takes a sort of naturalistic approach. So there's a preference for studying how people behave and think in their kind of natural settings. So unlike quantitative research, which often involves setting up sort of experimental conditions, qualitative studies really like to understand phenomena in their sort of natural social contexts. Excuse me. Another very common characteristic is that there's usually a kind of assumption that there are multiple perspectives. So qualitative research really accepts that different social actors have different perspectives on reality. And so there's not necessarily one kind of single truth or perspective. Qualitative research also very often has flexible research designs. So while with quantitative studies, it's pretty common to sort of plan everything before beginning the research. With qualitative studies, it's often more common for things to emerge iteratively. So sort of one can adapt things and plan things as one goes along. And then finally, this concept of reflexivity is very important concept with qualitative research. And really put simply, reflexivity is kind of the recognition that researchers are part of the process of producing the data and its meanings. And so it's kind of a conscious reflection of that involvement of the researchers. So this is quite different from quantitative research, where really there's quite an explicit attempt to remove the sort of potential biases of the researcher that they bring to data collection and analysis. But with most qualitative studies, really an alternative strategy is taken, and this is to really reflect on and account explicitly for the role of the researcher and the impact that they had on the research. So those are some of, I would say, sort of key characteristics of most qualitative research. So what is qualitative evidence synthesis, or QES for short? So really, a QES is a systematic review of primary qualitative studies in a topic area, and it has very much the same kind of aims to primary qualitative research. So really to understand people's perceptions and experiences of the world around them, including of health and illness, health and social care services, institutions, built environment, and other aspects of society. And then often a QES really aims to sort of build theories or conceptual models that help to explain the social world. And the principles that I mentioned in the previous slide for primary qualitative research very much are the same principles for a QES, and which we'll cover in this presentation. So why would one undertake a QES? So traditionally, systematic reviews have focused on quantitative evidence. So these kind of reviews have really explored questions such as, what is the effect of this intervention? What is the accuracy of this diagnostic tool? What is the cost of this intervention? But increasingly, it's being recognized that other kinds of questions and issues matter, and which qualitative evidence can answer. So, for example, within the context of research, primary research about health and illness, quantitative evidence might provide answers to questions such as, how many people have this condition? Or why do some people get this condition while others don't? How can we decide if someone has this condition? What happens to people who have this condition? What can we do to treat or prevent this problem? So those are the kind of questions that quantitative evidence can provide answers to. But these questions can be complemented with questions that qualitative evidence can provide answers to. So for example, and we're going to deal with many more kinds of questions, but just two examples. Qualitative evidence could provide evidence to, how do people view and experience this condition? Or what are the barriers and facilitators to accessing healthcare for this condition? Qualitative evidence is also increasingly being used in healthcare guidelines and kind of other decision-making processes. So here, quantitative evidence is usually used to inform kind of recommendations related to the effectiveness and side effects of treatments or an intervention, and also increasingly how much treatments cost. But also within the policymaking space, we're seeing that these kind of questions are being supplemented with questions that qualitative evidence can ask, can answer, such as, will this treatment be acceptable to people? Will this treatment be feasible to implement? Will this treatment increase or decrease equity concerns? So I just want to highlight one example amongst many, many others that are emerging of how qualitative evidence has contributed to the development of healthcare guidelines. So traditionally, antenatal care has been informed by kind of a biomedical perspective. So really, it was a kind of focus on identifying and treating high-risk pregnancies. And at the same time, these guidelines around antenatal care often really assumed that people have access to care. So as part of the development of its guidelines on antenatal care in 2016, the WHO commissioned a QES. And so here the QES focused on kind of exploring two main questions. So firstly, what are the processes and outcomes in antenatal care delivery that are important to pregnant, healthy women and those who support them? And then the QES also focused on exploring what barriers do women experience in accessing antenatal care. So the QES was conducted, and what it found was really the importance of this notion of a positive pregnancy experience. So what it found is that along with sort of biomedical issues, what really emerged is that women also really value a kind of positive experience when it comes to pregnancy and birth. And what this positive experience meant was more than just having a kind of healthy pregnancy in the kind of biomedical sense, but also about, for example, maintaining physical and socio-cultural normality, also having a kind of effective transition to positive labor and birth, amongst many other kind of issues that were revealed as being positive experience for women. And then the review also found that women experience a range of kind of social, cultural, economic, physical barriers in accessing antenatal care that was really previously assumed. And so the findings from this QES have informed the WHO guideline really in two important ways. So firstly, the scope of the guideline was widened to include interventions to improve access to antenatal care and also to kind of enhance the quality of the pregnancy experience, including, so for example, adding now recommendations around community-based antenatal care, the importance of continuity of care, woman-held antenatal records, and information and support provision to women and those who support them. And then secondly, the findings inform decisions on critical outcomes to be considered in the guidelines. So for example, the outcome of a positive pregnancy experience was now included in most of the guideline questions. So that's just one example amongst many, many more, and we're seeing really a growing use of qualitative evidence that is contributing to the development of guidelines and policy making in the area of health. Okay, so how does a qualitative evidence synthesis differ from a systematic review of quantitative evidence for those of you that are familiar with effectiveness reviews? So really, a QES has the same broad steps. So these include formulating the question, systematically searching for relevant studies, data extraction and quality assessment of those studies, synthesizing study findings, and then finally assessing the confidence in the review findings, or what is termed in systematic reviews of effectiveness, assessing the certainty of the evidence. So really the broad steps are just about exactly the same. But that said, there are some pretty important, essential differences between the principles and methods of systematic reviews of quantitative evidence and QES. And many of these differences really are very similar to the kind of differences between primary qualitative and quantitative research and the principles that are highlighted at the beginning of this presentation. So, for example, systematic reviews of quantitative evidence really aim to measure something, whereas the aim of a QES is to understand meaning, experiences, and often to develop theories on these. At the same time, the data for systematic reviews of quantitative evidence is usually numerical, whereas data for a QES is usually textual or visual. Systematic reviews of quantitative evidence also tend to be informed by what is kind of referred to as a positivist epistemology. So this really assumes that truth is kind of singular and it's out there and it's objective, and we as researchers can kind of access that truth. In contrast, a QES tends to be formed, although to varying degrees, but to sort of more interpretive or constructionist kind of epistemologies or paradigms. And this really accepts the social truth, maybe constructs, and that there are often multiple perspectives on something. In terms of research designs, a systematic review of quantitative evidence tends to really be fixed and the method sort of pre-specified. But for a QES, the research design is often more flexible and adapted kind of iteratively as one goes along. So, for example, with systematic reviews of effectiveness, the question, the inclusion and exclusion criteria, the search strategy, the outcomes, all of these are usually sort of predefined before the review begins. And those that do systematic reviews of effectiveness, correct me if I'm wrong, but they usually don't change all that much, or they shouldn't change during the review process. So with the QES, all of these components can be a lot more flexible and refined during the review process, sort of as one becomes immersed in the studies. Another key difference is that systematic reviews of quantitative evidence really aim to have exhaustive search strategies, whereas a QES often involves kind of sampling of studies, and we will come back to this issue quite a bit. And then finally, in terms of the roles of the researcher, the reviewers, with quantitative systematic reviews, there's this explicit attempt to remove the potential biases that the review team brings. But with the QES, this alternative strategy is used, and that I referred to earlier, this notion of reflexivity. So here, really an attempt to explicitly account for the role of the reviewers. So those are some of the sort of main, pretty fundamental differences between a QES and systematic reviews of effectiveness. And I'm going to break shortly for any questions and some discussion, but I firstly want to just introduce the first stage. So in this presentation, I'm going to go through very briefly each of the kind of main stages of conducting a QES, and to give you a sort of flavor of what these different stages involve. So the first stage is formulating the question. So, as I've been saying, the questions for a QES tend to be exploratory in nature. So tend to kind of focus on the kind of the how and the why of phenomena rather than the how much. So, for example, and these are some examples, there are many others, a QES might ask, how do people experience an illness or health condition or care issue? What are the barriers and facilitators to accessing or delivering healthcare? What impact do specific barriers and facilitators have on people, their experiences, and their behavior? The QES might also, and increasingly, is asking all sorts of kind of questions related to the implementation of an intervention. So, for example, it might ask, what are people's experiences of receiving an intervention? Why does an intervention work or not? For whom and in what circumstances? What external factors facilitate or hinder successful implementation of a program or service or treatment? And then how might an intervention need to be adapted for large-scale rollout or sustainability? And there are many, many other kinds of questions, but these are the sort of main sort of questions that a QES might ask. So various question frameworks exist to help with developing and refining the question for a QES. And so some of you that know about effectiveness reviews are probably familiar with the PICO framework. So this really involves defining the population, patient or problem, the intervention or exposure, the comparison or the sort of alternative to the intervention, and the outcomes. Now, a PICO framework is still used, and many people use it when formulating and refining a question for a QES. But other alternative question frameworks have emerged that at least I find can be more helpful for formulating and refining the question for a QES. So here, two commonly used ones are the SPICE and the SPIDER. So in typical qualitative style, we come up with these colorful names for things. So the SPICE framework, again, like the PICO, it involves defining sort of specific things for your review. So firstly, defining your setting. So that is the kind of where, in what context will your review focus. It involves defining your perspective. So whose views are you interested in? It involves defining the intervention or phenomenon of interest. So this is really, what are you interested in? What is your topic of focus? The comparison, so kind of what else? Often in QES, there isn't a comparison, or it's kind of somewhat implied. And then your evaluation. So what outcome, what results is your review interested in? And so these for a QES can often be attitudes, perceptions, experiences, barriers, facilitators, amongst many other kind of outcomes that one's interested in. So that's the SPICE. SPIDER is another commonly used QES kind of framework. It's very similar to SPICE, but has slightly different sort of criteria or elements that you need to define. So the first criteria is the sample, so the group of people that the QES is going to look at. The next criteria is the phenomenon of interest. So like the SPICE, that's really what you're going to be focusing on. There's then the design, so that's really the type of qualitative research to be included in the review, and this often can be broken down into kind of the overarching design of the studies, the data collection methods, and then also kind of analysis methods. So you then also have the evaluation, which, like the SPICE, are very much the outcomes of interest. And then finally you have the research type, which is really usually about whether you're going to include only qualitative studies, or are you also going to include mixed method studies. Okay, so I'm just going to do a quick little worked example just to illustrate an example of the SPICE. And this example comes from a Cochrane QES that myself and colleagues recently conducted. Sorry, I wonder if everyone could just mute themselves here, who've just joined here. So it was a recently conducted QES on childhood vaccination acceptance. So the research question for our QES, and I've written it here, was what factors influence the views and practices regarding routine childhood vaccination of parents and informal caregivers living in any setting globally where childhood vaccination is provided. So based on this question, let's try and do the SPICE together. So let's identify the different elements. I'm going to show the particular element, and I wonder if people can either just shout out, put your mic on, or write in the chat what you think the different elements would be. And Ari and Denny, if you can just watch that for me here. So based on what I've put as the review kind of focus, what was our setting? So what setting, context were we interested in for this review? Any thoughts? As I said, just shout out, raise your hand, but just go ahead and shout out. Anyone have any idea of what our setting was, what context we were interested in?
Any setting globally.
Yes, thank you. So yes, we were interested in any setting globally where childhood vaccination is provided. So we could have specified we are just interested in LIMICs, or we're just interested in studies in Africa, but we wanted this to be a global study. So yeah, thank you. So what was our perspective? So whose views were we interested in?
Parents and caregivers.
Yes, thank you. So absolutely, parents and informal caregivers. So again, for our review, we could have makers, decision makers, teachers, the public, but we were interested very much in parents and informal caregivers' perspectives. So what was our phenomenon of interest? So what was our topic of focus for the review?
Routine childhood vaccination.
Yeah, absolutely. So the focus was a little bit more specific. So the topic was childhood vaccination, but what specifically were we interested in?
Acceptance of
factors that influence the views and practices of routine childhood vaccination.
Yeah, spot on. Sorry, I can't see. I'm going to come back to you all short. I can't see who's answering, but on the ball, absolutely. So our focus was the factors that influencing routine childhood vaccination views and practices. Okay, what about the comparison? What was our comparison? Any takers? There's a bit of a tricky one there. So I will go ahead. So there actually wasn't a comparison, and this is very common. So with the QES, often we're not interested, like with an effectiveness review, of two things or comparing two things. One can be interested of kind of views and experiences of one particular thing versus another, but in a lot of cases there isn't actually comparison. Okay, and in terms of evaluation, so what outcomes were we interested in?
What should be the views and practices?
Yep, spot on there. So we were interested in views and practices and influencing factors. See, I've given you a little unfair. If I had have provided a little more information, we were interested in views and practices, but we also extracted other outcomes in the kind of decision making, knowledge, beliefs, so all those kind of terms around the demand side. So kind of fuller amount of outcomes, but our primary outcomes are really the views and practices and influencing factors. Yeah. Okay, so I hope that gives a little flavor of the spice and how you can use it when thinking about the different components of your review. Okay, so I've just put some what I think are quite useful introductory resources here to QES. Again, as I said, I've put all of these in our work package 6 for those on Geller. So you can have all of these that are there, but those that don't have access to the slides, all of these are also open access introduction to QES resources. So it's a good place to start, I would say these resources are. Okay, let me come back to you all and see if I can see you. Okay, wow, fantastic. We've had a big joining since I haven't been able to see you all. Okay, so I hope that's given a little bit of a flavor to introduction to QES. Sorry, Ari, I might need you to mute or to put your yeah, there, I think better. Yeah, thanks, Ari. Okay, so I wonder on this first stage if there are any questions, any comments, anything that's confusing, anything people wanted to ask. Yeah. Hi, Shlengiwe. Fantastic. Go ahead.
Hi, Sarah. Thank you so much for the great presentation. So I have a question to do with the search strategy or the sampling. Are you going to talk more about sampling and how it's done? Oh, you're on mute, but I think you're saying yes.
Sorry, yes, I'm on mute and I'm saying yes, sorry. And I should have said, I'm just going to check in after each section now, each little stage, just to check in if there are any questions. But the next stage is going to be searching and sampling. Yeah. So I don't know if you want to wait for your question then.
Yeah, then I'll wait. Thank
Perfect.
you.
Yeah, I just thought I would check in if there's anything, but also fine if there are no questions and we can continue. Okay, and like I said, if questions do come up, put them in the chat while we go, or feel free to as we go along as well. So just before we go to the, let's see if I can go like this, oops, to the next stage, I thought we could have just a little exercise to get us thinking. Let's just move this down. So just to spend 5-10 minutes, I thought just on your own, I will for the next exercise split people into groups, but I thought maybe everyone could just think about if you could think of a QES research question that you might like to conduct or that you think could be good to answer. So maybe you're working on a particular study, or you doing your PhD, or you have a quantitative review that you are working on. Maybe think about what could be a complementary QES question that you could ask. And when you think about it, you don't have to go into the specifics, but maybe think about some of the issues of, for example, the setting and the perspective, whose views you're interested in. So I think let's just take 5 minutes. And I see Sumant, you've got a question. Let's just take it. We'll do Sumant's question, and then let's just sit for 5 minutes on your own, just thinking about a question, and we'll have an opportunity if anyone wants to have a go of mentioning what they think could be a good question, and we could think about if it would work. But Sumant, over to you.
Hi, Sarah.
Hi,
In,
Sumant.
in Spider framework, what's the difference between the design and the research type?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a funny. If I had have designed Spider, Sumant, I would have maybe done it differently. But the design is really the nitty-gritties of the qualitative research studies. So it's all qualitative studies. What will be the overarching sort of methodologies that you'll include? What data collection methods you'll include? So focus groups, interviews, for example. What kind of analysis methods? So you might say we're only going to include qualitative studies that did critical social science types of analyses, as an example. So that's the sort of design related to the qualitative studies. The research type steps back and is really about, are you going to include qualitative and mixed method studies, or just qualitative studies? So you can do a QES where you include mixed method studies and then you extract just the qualitative data. I don't know if that makes sense and answers your question.
Yeah, my understanding is Spider is used when we are using the mixed methods studies, and Spice is used when we are purely focusing on the qualitative studies. So if we don't use mixed methods, then are we still using the Spider, or should we go for Spice?
You know, you can use both, and people use both. And then what would you do is, if you're not including mixed methods, you would just, for the research design, you just say, for the research type, sorry, you just say only qualitative studies. Yeah. So I've seen people include both for both. Yeah, for some reason, I don't know why, I prefer the Spice. But the Spider can be helpful when you're wanting more to the nitty-gritties. If you're going to sort of refine things of the research methods, it can be useful. But both are very much used for all kinds of QESs. Yeah.
Thanks,
So
Sarah.
I suggest trying them both, and you'll get a feel for which you prefer.
Yeah.
I saw another hand. Mariam, was it you?
There's a question
Yes, it
also on
was
the chat
me,
box.
but yeah, I was just wondering if there were specific conditions that would determine which you use, whether the Spice or the Spider.
Thanks,
I
Mariam.
think you're muted.
Yeah, sorry. And lovely to see you again. Well, to hear you again, Mariam. Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, others could chip in if that have done QESs. I am not aware of any criteria that would say you need to use one or the other. It's the classic, also more QES, where unlike with effectiveness reviews, things aren't as I was going to say rigid. Things aren't as fixed. Yeah? So you can use either, and both apply in all circumstances. There's no one or other. And actually, there are about 15 other kind of QES question frameworks that you can also use. So my rule of thumb, others might have different opinion, my rule of thumb is what you find the most helpful for thinking through your review. So it's very much what would facilitate or help you for thinking it through. They're so similar, these two. So you'll find you could look at a review and use both. But they are slightly different.